There's a local composer by the name of Joseph Bertolozzi who had this idea to create a piece of music using sounds recorded on the Mid-Hudson Bridge. He came to the Bridge Authority with this wild idea, and the Bridge Authority said, okay, let's see how this goes. And so him and the maintenance crew and others were out there banging on the suspender cables and on the railings and such. And he took those different sounds and they essentially became notes of this piece of music. It's actually a whole CD worth of music called Bridge Music.
Wait, you have a soundtrack? The bridges have a soundtrack?
Yeah, bridge music. If you go out onto the sidewalk of the Mid-Hudson Bridge between April and October, there's actually listening stations at each of the towers. A lot of people come onto the bridge not expecting that at all, and then they come across this speaker system and they're like, what is this? And they start pressing buttons and reading the panel and get to listen to this very unique piece of music.
I'm Matt Zucker, and this is Cidiot, learning to live and love life in the Hudson Valley. I've done episodes on the east side of the river, and probably not enough on the west side. But there's one thing that connects us all, literally, the bridges. So when the New York State Bridge Authority reached out to Cidiot, thinking this was a good idea to do an episode about the 5 crossings that they manage, I agreed that, yeah, it'd be a really good idea to do an episode about the bridges. So you'll meet Chris Steber, Public Information Officer for the New York State Bridge Authority. As he told me in his first email bringing up the idea, the Bridge Authority was created during Franklin Roosevelt's term as governor in 1932, and today operates the toll crossings from the Bear Mountain Bridge up to the Rip Van Winkle Bridge. Chris, a lifelong Dutchess County resident, takes us through the 5 major crossings and what's special about each one of them. For example, Bear Mountain really kicked off the golden age of bridge building in New York State and across the country. Then there's the priest to thank for the Mid-Hudson Bridge in Poughkeepsie, and why Roosevelt vetoed the Rip Van Winkle Bridge, and why the Rhinecliff-Kingston Bridge really doesn't go through Rhinecliff or Kingston. And we talk about ceremonial names and how I can get a bridge named after me. Then, as you heard in the opening, at the end, we'll get into bridge music, something I didn't even know until now existed. Okay, let's tune in.
Down in the valley, moved up from the city. It's a new way of living and I'm trying to get used to it. 1 park coolers, half an ounce of an idiot. Ordered a Manhattan and they call me a Cidiot. At first I hurt my feelings, but it's kinda got a ring to it. When you move to the country, they can tell when you're new to it. I'm looking at a place, but I'm trying to keep fitting in. It takes too long to be a local, so for now I'm a Cidiot.
Hi, Chris.
Hi, Matt.
Hey, thanks for coming on Cidiot.
Oh, it's my pleasure. I'm so excited to be here today.
I am too. I mean, you wrote about bridges connecting the Hudson Valley, which I think is so true. So I think this is very special for what my show's about and who it appeals to, but also this metaphor also with bridges, between people. I mean, so much of my show is connecting weekenders to full-timers and locals to newcomers. And so bridges are like a big thing for me. So I'm excited to also geek out also into the details of these things that we cross every day and we probably underestimate.
Absolutely. There's such a connecting force in the region, and they really make us not just an east side of the Hudson or a west side of the Hudson. They really, truly make us a Hudson River Valley.
Okay, so maybe we start with you about are you from the Valley?
I'm a lifelong Dutchess County resident. My mother was from Wappingers Falls. I was raised in Poughkeepsie. I've always had a great interest in this area. My parents taught me a real appreciation for what we have in our backyard. My father was originally from Michigan, came out here, kind of the classic story, was hired by IBM, had a career with them for many years. And he really loves this area, loves the beauty, the nature, the history, and instilled a lot of that in me. And then on my mother's side, both of my grandparents were very civically involved. My grandfather had a career with the Postal Service and ended up being appointed the postmaster. And then when he retired, he ran for village mayor and served for a couple of years with that. And so when I was a little kid, he was one of my primary babysitters. And I would often be walking around Wappingers Falls with him while he was in his capacity as mayor, and or if he was stopping by the firehouse because he was a volunteer firefighter at one point. I just thought it was so cool to go to places like Village Hall and to the firehouse, and really started to get me thinking about the concept of community and serving your neighbors.
Nice, nice. And how did you find your way to bridges? I mean, I grew up wanting to be in advertising for some reason. I never thought about infrastructure or the things around me in the world.
My first encounter with the New York State Bridge Authority was as a kid. Like many kids, I was in the back seat of a car while my father was driving across, in this case, the Mid-Hudson Bridge. This was in the early days of Easy Pass. We didn't have an Easy Pass tag yet, so we were online at the toll booth. My dad was fumbling for his 75 cents or $1, whatever the toll was at that time. And I remember I was in the back seat and I said to my father, "How come we have to pay for this bridge? Shouldn't we just get across for free?" and, and my father said, "Well, it has to be paid for somehow. So the people who use the bridges are the people who pay for the bridge." And little did I know, years later, I would be preaching that to everybody in the Hudson Valley. The other thing I didn't realize, at the time, I saw this administration building here in Highland in Ulster County, and it saw New York State Bridge Authority, saw that it was a headquarters building, and I thought, wow, are they in charge of every bridge in New York State? Well, I was wrong about that too. Only in charge of the vehicular bridges between the Bear Mountain Bridge and the Rip Van Winkle Bridge, all here in the Hudson Valley.
Yeah. So I guess, so what does the authority do?
The whole thing is to operate and maintain the bridge crossings that are entrusted to us. Bear Mountain being our southernmost bridge, Rip Van Winkle being our northernmost bridge. So we really kind of have our foothold in that lower Hudson Valley area, as well as up toward the upper Hudson Valley and Catskill Mountains area. The toll money that we collect stays with us, goes back into the maintenance and upkeep of the bridges. So when you're paying your toll dollar, it goes back to the authority. It's not going to repair a pothole out in another part of the state. It's not padding the state budget or anything else. It's not subsidizing anything but the bridges. So the people who use the bridges are the people who pay for the bridges.
Let's talk about the different crossings and stuff. I kind of like the backstory and I'm kind of curious about, why they're named what they are and why they are where they are. Maybe take us through each one.
Well, of course, the first bridge over the Hudson River was the Poughkeepsie Highland Railroad Bridge. And I won't get into too much related to that because there's people who could really do an entire podcast episode about the story of how that railroad bridge came into existence, how there was the catastrophic fire in 1974 that shut down rail service, and then how it sat vacant for 3.5 decades. And then in 2009 was reopened as the Walkway Over the Hudson State Historic Park. We do actually maintain the bridge structure for the old railroad bridge, now the Walkway Over the Hudson. So it's kind of an interesting public-private partnership in that we maintain the bridge structure, State Parks operates the park that's on top of the bridge, and then there's a nonprofit friends group that helps to do fundraising and programming and marketing for the park. It takes a lot of players to keep the Walkway Over the Hudson running and as a wonderful community asset that it is.
Yeah, it's like the biggest or longest pedestrian something or other in America or something.
They say longest elevated pedestrian bridge in the United States, or certainly might be second longest now. I think there was a bridge out in Colorado, but I haven't checked the exact stats to verify myself.
All right, well, here, let's talk about the real bridges, the ones that the cars go over, the vehicular ones, the real ones.
The ones we collect money on.
Yes, the self-funding bridges.
You always have to start with the Bear Mountain Bridge, and that's what I call the granddaddy of the vehicular crossings over the Hudson. That was the first vehicular crossing over the Hudson River south of Albany. So it was really a trendsetter in many ways. When you think about that part of the Hudson River, anybody who's, for example, taken the Metro North train down to Grand Central and you go along the riverside, you'll notice that when you get to that section from West Point to just a little bit south of the Bear Mountain Bridge, you see that it's at one of its narrowest, most windy points. And that's why it was so critically important during the American Revolution. We're on the 250th anniversary of that right now. So it's important to realize how strategically important the Hudson River was during that war. And therefore, there were quite a few different military installations along that area, West Point being probably the most famous example because it turned into the U.S. Military Academy. But in the vicinity of the Bear Mountain Bridge, there were actually two forts on each side of the Popolopan Creek. Fort Montgomery, which is today a state historic site, and then on the southern end of the creek was Fort Clinton. There was actually a battle there in 1777. And the reason I mention that is when you look at some of the different locations for bridges, whether it's here or elsewhere in New York, you often find that they are located near where different forts were located during the Revolution or during the early history of this country. So that was a narrow, windy part of the Hudson. So you had those two forts there that were keeping an eye on the British. If you look at the George Washington Bridge, which is a Port Authority bridge, that was around the location of Fort Lee and Fort Washington, I believe it was. And I think the Throgs Neck Bridge, there's a similar story with that. I have to credit a former executive director who enlightened me about that.
Yeah, no, that's good.
So because it was such a narrow part of the Hudson, there had been different proposals over the years to connect the two sides of the river there. And then in the early 1900s, Bear Mountain State Park was created. It was actually supposed to be a site for a state prison. It was basically going to be Sing Sing Prison Part 2. And there were a lot of people, probably most prominently the Harriman family, who raised their voices to stop the construction of that prison and to preserve it as parkland. We're very fortunate due to the foresight of the Harriman family, particularly Mary Harriman. She donated thousands of acres of land and also a $1 million endowment to help protect portions of the Hudson Highlands. So today, those land parcels are part of Bear Mountain and Harriman state parks. So they became very popular destinations, particularly for the New York City crowd, because it wasn't that far away. They could get up the river by ferry and enjoy the outdoors and the fresh, clean air. A number of recreational facilities have been developed there at Bear Mountain over the years. But around that time, the automobile was becoming more and more popular, and the ferries just couldn't handle the service. So the Harriman family helped to finance a company that was given a charter by the state legislature to build and maintain a bridge in that section of the river. And that became the Bear Mountain Hudson River Bridge Company. So that's an important distinction because that infrastructure project was actually done by a private enterprise. A lot of people don't realize that. There was always a stipulation that eventually it would come under the ownership of New York State, but it did start as a private business originally.
So it was basically built to get people to the park?
Yeah, the park was a big reason for that. There's also a legend. The Harrimans did have an estate in southern Orange County, and so some people speculate that maybe they wanted to get more easily to their estate over there, but I haven't seen a written source to back that up. The bridge actually was completed in less than 2 years' time without a single loss of life. There was an opening ceremony on November 26, 1924. It was a big to-do. Mrs. Harriman unveiled this plaque that is on the side of the administration building. It's now our security office at the bridge. The building wasn't even finished with construction yet. And then the bridge opened to the general public the next day on Thanksgiving Day, 1924. Coincidentally, the same day as the first Macy's Thanksgiving Day parade. So two notable things that started on that day. And at the time, it did have the distinction of being the longest suspended span in the world, longest distance between the two towers. Didn't hold that record for very long, but we always like to say that the Bear Mountain Bridge helped to kick off a golden age of bridge building here in New York State and really across the country. And it's also important to note that at the time, tolls were charged each direction on the bridge. They were 80 cents for each car, plus there were surcharges for passengers. There was a toll on Bear Mountain Bridge Road, which a lot of locals like to call the Goat Trail, that leads you down toward Peekskill, because the bridge company owned that as well. You adjust that for inflation today.
Yeah, that sounds like a lot of money for the 1920s.
Yeah, it was very expensive to go across the bridge in those days.
Okay, so Bear Mountain, and then what?
If you're talking chronologically, the Mid-Hudson Bridge came next, connecting Poughkeepsie and Highland. And I absolutely love the story of that because it was really a grassroots effort. Poughkeepsie did have the railroad bridge, of course, but there was no way for pedestrians or horse and wagons, and then later on automobiles, to get across the river there. They had to rely on ferries, or if the river was frozen enough, some people would actually walk across or even drive across, which is just crazy to think. As with any bridge, it takes a true effort of the community and of different leaders and engineers and construction workers to make it a reality. But I think if we could thank one person in particular, it's actually a priest by the name of Monsignor Joseph Sheehan, who was the pastor of what was then St. Peter's Church in Poughkeepsie. At that time, it occupied a building that is still there today on Mill Street, has a white steeple and a gold cross. And Monsignor Sheehan first came to Poughkeepsie to become the pastor there around 1906, and he served there till his death in 1934, so he was there for almost 30 years. And from everything I've heard about him, he was quite a remarkable figure because he not just thought about the people who were showing up for Mass on Sunday inside the four walls of his church, but he was really looking at the benefit of the wider community. FDR actually referred to him as that splendid pastor of many flocks. And as early as 1913, Sheehan was advocating for some type of bridge crossing between Poughkeepsie and Highland, and he felt very strongly that it would be of great benefit to the people and the businesses of Poughkeepsie. He submitted some drawings to the newspaper. I don't know if they were done by him or somebody else, but there was one where there was a bridge right alongside of the railroad bridge. There was another drawing where it showed a second deck below the railroad tracks on the railroad bridge where people could walk across or vehicles could go across. The idea started to catch on, and in 1922, Sheehan, the Kiwanis Club, the Poughkeepsie Chamber of Commerce, and other civic leaders banded together and created the Hudson Valley Bridge Association. Its purpose was to push for the state to build a new bridge at Poughkeepsie. So keep in mind, Bear Mountain Bridge was almost under construction at that point. It was getting that charter from the state legislature. I'm sure the people of Poughkeepsie were starting to hear about that and were thinking about what could happen in our community. And so the Bridge Association had to make their case to the legislature. And so they wanted to enlist a prominent name to back up the idea. So they ended up hiring an engineering firm that was headed by General George Goethals. If the name sounds familiar.
Yeah, I'm from Jersey. Yeah, Goethals is the bridge from Elizabeth to Staten Island, right?
Yes, that's named after him. He was in the Army, and he was the first, I believe he was the first American military governor of the Panama Canal Zone, and became known as this great civil engineer because of overseeing the Panama Canal. He wasn't really very much of a bridge engineer, but they did have these plans drawn up by his engineering firm. It was more of a cantilever structure as opposed to a suspension bridge. So it kind of looked a little bit more like, maybe the Rip Van Winkle Bridge in design, but still it was getting that idea across that Poughkeepsie wanted a bridge and needed a bridge to benefit its residents and businesses and the wider community. So in 1923, a bill in the state legislature was passed. It was signed by Governor Al Smith to build and fund the bridge. The state's top engineer, Frederick Stewart Green, would oversee the project. This is kind of a fun fact. He was a veteran of the First World War. He became the superintendent of Public Works, which was a precursor to the Department of Transportation for New York State. But he was also a published writer of horror fiction. So he had a bit of an artistic side to him as well. They ended up hiring the engineering firm of Majeski and Moran. Ralph Majeski is regarded as one of the greatest bridge engineers of all time. He was originally from Poland, but came to the United States and built up this engineering firm that is actually still around today. It's called Majeski and Masters, and they actually have a branch office here in Poughkeepsie. They're headquartered down in Pennsylvania, and they're still doing bridge engineering work to this day.
What's it like to construct bridges? What's the story there?
Well, the Mid-Hudson probably has the most interesting story behind its construction, and it took quite a long time for it to be completed. It started in 1925. There was a cornerstone that was laid by Governor Smith. If you ever go into the local history room at Adrian's Library in Poughkeepsie, they actually have the trowel that he allegedly used to set the cornerstone in place. So that was pretty cool to see. And the cornerstone was laid in October of 1925. Construction started. It was predicted that the bridge would open in 1928, but it didn't open until 1930. Now, why is that? That was because on July 27th, 1927, a major accident brought construction to a halt. That was when the caissons were being put in to the riverbed. A caisson is basically what you end up constructing the piers for the bridge in. The caisson ended up tilting about 42 degrees. And so the workers, the engineers had to figure out what to do with this. So they had to figure out a solution, and ultimately they came up with this solution involving different pulleys and barges to basically get it up into place. And so construction was able to proceed after that. And I love this quote that the Poughkeepsie Eagle News wrote. And they had said that the engineers and construction crews had been actors in an engineering epic, a story in which skill, brains, and above all, courage and quiet confidence match themselves against the forces of nature and won. So long as the bridge stands, it will be a monument to those men who fought the good fight against long odds and triumphed over every obstacle. How poetic.
So they turned like a disaster into a good thing. They figured it out.
Almost miraculously. Construction was able to proceed ahead, and the bridge was opened on August 25th, 1930. There were thousands of people who showed up, and a number of dignitaries were there, including former Governor Al Smith, who had signed the legislation and kicked off the construction project, and his wife, Catherine Smith, was there. And then, of course, the governor at that time was Franklin Roosevelt. And so Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt were also at the opening of the bridge. And so Catherine Smith cut the ribbon on the east side of the bridge, and Eleanor Roosevelt cut it on the west side of the bridge.
Oh.
And there's this incredible footage of this mass of people going out onto the bridge, just kind of almost stampeding to the bridge. And tolls were suspended until I think sunset that night. There were fireworks displays at a local amusement park and a clam bake and a dance off at the pavilion. It was really this huge event for the community. It's also important to note that tolls were very expensive, especially in the midst of the Great Depression. They were 80 cents in each direction, plus the surcharges for passengers. There were toll rates for pedestrians. There were even toll rates for livestock if you were bringing them across the bridge. Mid-Hudson often gets pointed to as among the most beautiful suspension bridges in the country. It has this kind of almost Gothic look to it. A lot of people have described it as that. So a lot of people say that the Bear Mountain Bridge is probably the most beautiful in terms of where it is in terms of scenery, but Mid-Hudson has this just very striking structure to it.
Okay, I want to talk about the Rip Van Winkle because it's got a legendary story associated with it. The other bridges are like place names, and this gets an interesting name. So I'm curious why it gets an interesting name and the others get their geography. But that's the bridge I go across the most now that I moved up from Rhinecliff up to Hudson.
Yeah. And the Rip Van Winkle is so important to the history of the Bridge Authority because that's the whole reason we exist. Bear Mountain was a private enterprise that constructed it. Mid-Hudson was being constructed by the State Department of Public Works. And so because those two bridges were either opened or in progress at that point, the people in the Catskill and Hudson area were starting to say, hey, we need a bridge of our own to connect.
Right. What about us?
Greene and Columbia counties. And so there was a bill that passed through the legislature that would authorize the construction of a bridge in that area. And Governor Roosevelt actually vetoed the legislation. He thought it was a good idea, but it was the Great Depression, and the state just didn't have the funds to commit to it. And so Roosevelt and the state looked to basically the Port Authority model or the public authorities model to create a state entity that would focus on the maintenance and upkeep and operations of bridges in the Hudson Valley. And in 1932, the New York State Bridge Authority was created through an act of the state legislature. And so 1933, NYSBA took over the Mid-Hudson Bridge, and then July of 1935 was when the Rip Van Winkle Bridge opened to the public. I know originally when it was being proposed or under construction, a lot of people were referring to it simply as the Catskill Hudson Bridge. I don't know how exactly it got the name Rip Van Winkle, but anybody who's been to Greene County knows how much they pride themselves on that story by Washington Irving of Rip Van Winkle, who went up into the Catskill Mountains and fell asleep for 20 years and missed the Revolutionary War and comes back to his village and to a very changed world. Yeah, it's a story that's known the world over. So it's a great point of community pride for the region in general. And so I think it's so cool that we have this bridge in our area that is named after a literary figure, not just an author, it's a character in a story. I mean, how cool is that?
Right. Yeah, it is funny. And I love his silhouette and the signs for it everywhere. And you're right, Greene County loves it. Like it's all over Tannersville and everything. Okay, there's one more vehicle bridge, right? The Newburgh one.
Before Newburgh, there was actually the Kingston-Rhinecliff Bridge that was opened.
Right, I forgot. Yeah.
Yeah. The Kingston-Rhinecliff Bridge opened in 1957. Bridge construction really kind of took a big pause during World War II. And I think the Korean War also had some effects on construction of different infrastructure projects, particularly bridge-related ones. But Kingston was that area of Ulster County was growing a lot, with IBM having opened a facility just outside of the city of Kingston. You're talking about place names here. Now, that's called the Kingston Rhinecliff Bridge, but Rhinecliff is a hamlet. It's the location of an Amtrak station for anybody who's taken the Amtrak up north. So why is it called the Rhinecliff Bridge if it doesn't really go to Rhinecliff?
I know, it's just north of the hamlet, right? And it's really Rhinebeck, and it's on the border of Red Hook. And then the Kingston side's not even in Kingston. You're still several miles from Kingston.
Yeah, it's the town of Ulster, which some people don't realize. So originally, it was supposed to connect Kingston, the city of Kingston, and Rhinecliff. It was basically going to go from about where Kingston Point Park is over to where Rhinecliff Hamlet is. And it was going to connect with that road that takes you up to, I believe it's Market Street in the village of Rhinebeck. So it was supposed to be a suspension bridge. The design was going to be very similar to the Mid-Hudson Bridge, but because of different considerations, political and economic considerations, the bridge was moved a few miles upstream. And because of the location, a suspension bridge wasn't the best design for that part of the river. And so they came up with that underdeck truss bridge. And so that opened in February of 1957. It wasn't fully complete yet because the river had frozen over and the ferry could not operate. And there were workers that needed to get to their job on the other side of the river. And so the Bridge Authority and the state had this kind of impromptu opening ceremony in February of that year. But then they had a more formal ceremony, I think, in May of that year. And it's been in operation ever since.
But it has another name, though. It also says like George Clinton on it, which is but I don't understand what a ceremonial name is versus the real name, because nobody calls it that.
Yeah, so except for Rip Van Winkle Bridge is the name of the Rip Van Winkle Bridge. The other bridges have some kind of place-based name to them, but each of them has a ceremonial designation. And that's really up to the state legislature to decide. And so over time, there were opportunities or, I guess a desire to name pieces of infrastructure after different figures who contributed to the region, but rather than confuse people and completely rename a bridge, they decided to go the ceremonial name option instead. So in that case, with Kingston Rhinecliff, it's named after George Clinton, the first governor of the state of New York. And the Mid-Hudson is ceremonially named after Franklin D. Roosevelt, who of course was at the opening ceremony there.
Oh.
Newburgh-Beacon Bridge after Hamilton Fish, who was a former congressman, later a Secretary of State in the 19th century. And there were a number of his descendants also with the name Hamilton Fish who served the Hudson Valley in Congress. The most recent ceremonial designation came in 2018 when the legislature passed a bill to designate the Bear Mountain Bridge as the Purple Heart Veterans Memorial Bear Mountain Bridge. And that is in recognition of the Hudson Valley's military history. If you go a little bit north of that bridge, there's the Purple Heart Hall of Honor in New Windsor. George Washington, he established what became the Purple Heart in Orange County back in 1782. We had this really nice ceremony with a bunch of veterans groups to unveil that sign. It was just very nice to gather for that.
So the legislature really comes up with it. So I wanted you on the show so I could get a bridge named after me, but I'm really talking to the wrong person. I got to go to Albany, huh?
Yeah, talk to your legislators.
Yeah, if I want a Cidiot bridge, right?
Hey, Cidiot, get up through!
So now what about the fifth bridge, the Newburgh Beacon Bridge? I have a lot of Beaconites listening.
What would we be without the Newburgh Beacon Bridge? It's hard to fathom that it's our newest bridge, being that it is by far the most traveled of our bridges.
It is?
It is. It didn't come about until 1963. There had been an idea of putting a bridge between Newburgh and Beacon for quite some time, but took a long time for it to come to fruition. Short version of the story, from my understanding, is that New York State was uncertain of just how to pay for the bridge or whether they would get matching federal funds for the project. So in 1960, Governor Nelson Rockefeller and the chairman of the Bridge Authority at that time agreed on kind of a more conservative approach to building the bridge. They had Majeski and Masters design a bridge that had one lane going in each direction. And that's what opened in November of 1963. That ended up being a little short-sighted because the I-84 corridor was developed and that bridge just was not able to handle the capacity of an interstate there. And so pretty quickly, the state realized that another span needed to be constructed next to it. And so in 1980, what we call the south span of the Newburgh Beacon Bridge, that's the bridge that takes you over to Beacon. It's a little bit wider. It's got 3 lanes plus a breakdown lane, but that opened to the public in 1980. And then the north span was redecked and was reconfigured so that westbound traffic could go across there. Really, it's because of the Newburgh Beacon Bridge that we're able to keep toll rates so low, because we have so many trucks going across Interstate 84, including a number from out of state, and commercial trucks do pay a higher rate. You know, it's still pretty reasonable for a commercial rate. A lot of trucks will sometimes use the Newburgh Beacon Bridge, for example, to, if they don't have to go through New York City, they could bypass that if they're on their way up to New England, for example. Because of that interstate traffic and because of the number of people that use it, that accounts for a significant portion of our revenue, and hence part of the reason why we're able to charge a low toll rate across the entire system, because all the tolls have to be at the same rate.
Are any new bridges coming? You can tell us. Don't tell anyone.
No new bridges are in the works right now. I think if a new bridge were to ever come about, there would have to be a movement similar to how these other bridges came about. There would have to be that grassroots movement of citizens banding together, of the different chambers of commerce or organizations that had an interest in that, and the elected officials coming together. The thing to keep in mind is if we did build a new bridge, we'd have to pay for that somehow. And so building a new bridge would be quite a bit more expensive than maintaining our existing structures. So we're always looking at ways to try to alleviate traffic or to help it flow more smoothly at our bridges. And I think things like Easy Pass have helped with that. And then certainly the transition to cashless tolling has helped with the flow of traffic. And we've actually seen accidents go down pretty significantly at our spans, especially eastbound traffic where the toll booths used to be. So that's helped with alleviating some of the traffic.
Thanks for tuning into Cidiot. We'll close out the talk with Chris, hearing about bridge music. But before that, I just wanted to get a commercial break in. I'm looking for 2 things from the best fan base in the pod space. That's you. Cidiot's looking for additional sponsors for more episodes this season. So get in touch if you're interested or want to refer a business. Sponsorship helps cover production, promotion, and helping Cidiot grow. You can also help just by rating the show on Apple or Spotify or at the website, and by subscribing to my new Substack, Sugar and Spice. There I talk about memoir, marketing, and of course, moving to the Hudson Valley. My 3 M's. Hey, thanks to Brett Barry, by the way, who's been a guest editor. Brett hosts the award-winning and highly regarded Catscast, the Catskill podcast, and is an amazing sound engineer, as well as voice talent and professor. Okay, enough with advertising. Back to the show, and let's hear about bridge music.
So that's interesting about the connection to Olana and the Hudson River School. Like this is a place for art, and you've got a lot of art and architecture and design all along the Hudson Valley. Are there any other things about the bridges we should know about that are connected to the design or art community?
Yeah, like I mentioned, some of these engineers that were connected to the bridge had an artistic side to them. But looking toward more recent history, in 2009, there was actually a sound art installation installed at the Mid-Hudson Bridge. There's a local composer by the name of Joseph Bertolozzi who had this idea to create a piece of music using sounds recorded on the Mid-Hudson Bridge. He came to the Bridge Authority with this wild idea, and the Bridge Authority said, okay, let's see how this goes. And so him and the maintenance crew and others were out there banging on the suspender cables and on the railings and such. And he took those different sounds and they essentially became notes of this piece of music. It's actually a whole CD worth of music called Bridge Music. And if you go out onto the sidewalk of the Mid-Hudson Bridge between April and October, there's actually listening stations at each of the towers. And so you can press these buttons and listen to that music. So it's a really unique element to the bridge. And Joe has actually gone on to play the Eiffel Tower. He created tower music over there in Paris. So, really quite a vision he had that, really surprises people. A lot of people come onto the bridge not expecting that at all. And then they come across this, speaker system and they're like, what is this? And they start pressing buttons and reading the panel and get to listen to this very unique piece of music.
I love it. I'm going to open my windows and blast bridge music.
Yeah.
Okay, clearly you like the Hudson Valley and you connect us all to each other. But what's your favorite go-to place? I ask every guest about their favorite go-to place in the Hudson Valley.
What's my favorite place besides our bridges? It's really hard to pick. There's two places that I feel like sometimes don't get as much attention. One is my favorite free thing to do in the area, and that's the Francis Lehman Loeb Art Center at Vassar College. It's a nice little museum, got a great collection of artwork from ancient Egyptian art up to modern day art. They have a nice collection of Hudson River School paintings in one of the galleries. And they have some, pretty well-known artists on display in there. So definitely check it out. I love just browsing through there and just taking some quiet time and enjoying some nice pieces of art. And the other place that is kind of off the beaten path is an estate called Weathersfield. And if you travel on Route 44 going east toward the Connecticut state line, go past Millbrook, but before you get to Amenia, you go off Route 44 for a few minutes, and there's this historic site called Weathersfield. And it was an estate that belonged to a guy named Chauncey Stillman, and it's on this hilltop overlooking the rolling hills of eastern Dutchess County. And there's these amazing Italian-style gardens up there. And if you get the chance to go into the house, there's this really cool room where there's these beautiful frescoes on the ceiling. I just was really struck by the place, and it's kind of a hidden gem. It's not open all the time, so go check out their website to find out when they're open. But even if you just go through the gardens, it's such a nice place to go to.
That's great. I've never heard of it. I'll put a link to it in the show notes. Thank you.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks, Chris, for coming on. I think we learned a lot about bridges and the connective tissue all around us.
My pleasure, Matt. And it's one of those things that once you learn about the bridges and think about how much they contribute to our connectedness and the fabric of our life here in the Hudson Valley, you really walk away with a new appreciation for them.
Great. Thank you.
Down in the valley, moved up from the city. It's a new way of living, and I'm trying to get used to it. 1 part poodles, half an ounce of an idiot. Ordered a Manhattan, and they call me a Cidiot. At first I hurt my feelings, but it's kinda got a ring to it. When you move to the country, they can tell when you're new to it. I'm looking at a place, but I'm trying to keep fitting in. It takes too long to be a local, so for now I'm a Cidiot.